Alias Grace by Margaret Atwood features a character who is extremely interesting. The story depicts a fictionalized history of the real Grace Marks, a servant who is imprisoned for murder in the 1800s, and revolves around Grace retelling her life story to Dr. Simon Jordan, a psychologist intending to help her recover her memory, though he is unsure whether she is simply lying about having lost them in the first place. The novel deals with themes of justice, poverty, and the idea of truth within narrative. This essay will look at how Atwood makes Grace Marks fascinating, through the way language is used to obscure whether Grace is mad, lying, or maybe even genuinely possessed. The very first chapter of the book opens with a first-person narrative of Grace being led to the governor's house. It is a very stark and jarring opening, which is instantly intriguing and starts to dig into the core issues of the book. Grace describes her surroundings and then the aspects of herself that she can see, telling us that her hands are clasped in front of me, they're chapped, the knuckles reddened. I can't remember a time they were not like that. Here the language is already vague and open to interpretation, though either interpretation leads us to have sympathy for Grace. Either she cannot remember a time when her knuckles were not sore, implying that she has always had a tough life filled with hard work and physical pain, or she cannot remember a time when her hands weren't shackled, demonstrating her long incarceration, which is shortly confirmed when she tells us she has been locked up since the age of 16, an extremely young age to be permanently locked away. Immediately then we take an interest in Grace's character as she elicits such strong sympathy as a woman who is still living an extremely hard and cruel life. Still within Chapter 1, however, we are introduced to the idea of Grace as an unreliable narrator, that the information we gain from her might not be entirely trustworthy. After describing a somewhat horrifying vision of being trapped, a man is standing there with a candle, blocking the stairs to go up, and the cellar walls are all around me, and I know I will never get out. We still have complete empathy and pity for Grace as she describes this terrifying and claustrophobic scene. Initially, this suggests Grace is so powerfully haunted by the crimes she has either witnessed or perpetrated that she is having hallucinations and perhaps has been driven mad. The chapter ends, however, with a sentence all on its own. This is what I told Dr. Jordan when we came to that part of the story. This presents a slightly ominous tone and leaves us with a lot of questions. Who is Dr. Jordan? Why is she telling a story? But it also raises the idea that Grace is the one who is deciding what is included in the narrative. By saying, "This is what I told," our attention is drawn to the idea that Grace gets to curate aspects of the story and she decides what is included, and that she can outright lie and we wouldn't know the difference. It also shows she views the events in her life as a story, which suggests fiction, which she can mould to her own purposes. This flips the idea of a powerless character we feel sympathy for on its head, and we begin to feel wary of her and realise that she has control over any information that we gain of her. Atwood uses punctuation to blur the space between speech and thought and make Grace harder to read or discern as a character, again giving her more power. In the chapters narrated by Grace in first person, no speech marks are used to denote when someone is speaking. This gives us a sense of Grace having little separation between her thoughts and speech, but in reality the opposite is true. She has a great command over her thoughts and rarely lets what she is actually thinking slip out. She deliberately chooses how to present herself to Dr. Jordan, though we feel that we get to see the inner workings. In her first meeting with Dr. Jordan, she deliberately feigns ignorance. The apple of the tree of knowledge is what he means. Good and evil. Any child could guess it, but I will not oblige. I go back to my stupid luck. Are you a preacher? I say. By not putting hers or any other speech into speech marks, we are held into suspense as to which parts Grace speaks out loud and which are internal monologue. There is often a huge difference between what Grace says and what she thinks, making her seem duplicitous and careful. Usually, as shown here, Grace ends speech by telling us that this is what she said or told the person. Her thoughts, likewise, are only shown to be internal after she has voiced them in the narrative. This can be quite shocking in places, as for a moment we think she may have been quite rude or aggressive, only to find out that she has kept these thoughts to herself, and we see how much she is holding back, which makes us question if she is even being honest with us, as readers. Grace retells the story of her childhood, and while again this evokes incredible sympathy, having grown up in a poverty-stricken and abusive household, there are still moments which make us question Grace's moral standing. At one point, Grace admits to having considered drowning her younger siblings, so there would not be so many mouths to feed, nor so many clothes to wash. At the time, she must have been around 12, so this is an extremely dark and worrying thought for a child that young to have. At first, we might consider that her honesty in telling us this shows that it was not a serious thought, or that the idea of not having enough food caused her to feel personally in danger of starvation due to the other children, but it is the secondary reason she gives which could be more telling. Grace explains that she was in charge of laundry due to her parents being rather useless. The idea that she would drown her siblings, in part to get out of doing work, shows a darker side to Grace's personality which she lets slip here, seemingly accidentally, hidden among the more reasonable excuses. When Grace is subject to hypnotism midway through the book, there is a suggestion that she may have committed the murders while possessed by a spirit. Earlier in the book, Grace explains that upon the death of her friend Mary Whitney, she hears her voice saying, "Let me in," and blacks out, though she said she had been witnessed waking up during this blackout and asking where Grace had gone. This is obviously very disturbing and plants a seed suggesting Grace has been possessed by her dead friend temporarily. Later in the story, a Dr. Dupont comes to hypnotize Grace to see if he can reclaim her memory, and upon seeing him, she tells us that Dr. Dupont is in fact her old friend Jeremiah the peddler, a semi-homeless travelling salesman who appears repeatedly in her narrative, though now he is disguised and considerably trimmed as to hair and beard and got up like a gentleman. This extremely unlikely turn of events is shocking to the reader and seems to shift the story from a serious historical fiction to a more fantastical story of escape. When Dupont/Jeremiah performs the hypnotism, Grace seemingly admits to the murder, but then Grace says, "Stop talking rubbish, I am not Grace. Grace knew nothing about it." By speaking in the third person, this gives strength to the idea that Grace is possessed, has not committed any crimes, and our sympathy returns to her entirely. The story has evolved, and as a reader we see Grace through a new, fascinating, supernatural lens, though again it is unclear whether this is part of a ruse cooked up by Grace and Jeremiah to get Grace out of prison, though in the end this does not work and she remains there for several more years. In a final twist, Atwood throws a spanner in the works yet again to undo any sense of clarity we had over Grace's character. By the final chapter of the book, we have either decided that Grace is innocent and was possessed by her dead friend Mary, or a liar, scheming her way out of prison with the help of her friend Jeremiah the peddler. Several years after Jeremiah appeared as Dr. Dupont, Grace writes a letter from prison to Jeremiah, as she has seen a poster for a new travelling show he is in, though she has been told he looks very different. He said, "Your beard was bright red, so I expect you have dyed it unless it is a wig." To convincingly dye a beard red or wear a beard wig seems a little far-fetched, but we brush this off as part of the more fantastical side of the story. Many years later, again, Grace travels to her new home in New York, and she sees a poster for a celebrated medium. Though the picture is obscured, she assumes it to be Jeremiah, and tells us that he has changed his appearance and name yet again, seeing him in the street, and that he gave me a respectful tip of the hat, but very slight so it wouldn't be remarked. At this point it seems extremely unlikely that Jeremiah would have popped up again in Grace's life, and leaves us with a worrying idea. Grace has been imagining Jeremiah in all of these places. This gives one final new option to our reading of Grace as a character. She isn't pretending to be mad, she is mad. Years of loneliness and abuse have caused her to see her only true living friend everywhere, and imagine that anyone who looks a little like him is him, in disguise, helping her from the shadows. This adds one final incredible facet to the character, which brings the reader back to Grace one final time in complete awe. In conclusion, Atwood shows Grace to be an incredibly interesting, though not entirely likeable, character. She uses punctuation, word choice, and the idea of an unreliable narrator to create a character which the reader finds fascinating, as the characters in the story do. Grace elicits both sympathy, due to her harsh upbringing and squalid conditions within prison, and repulsion, thanks to the parts of her inner monologue which are dark and often suggest a more violent and vindictive personality than her speech would have you believe. Atwood manages to leave things open to interpretation in a way that makes Grace both unsettling and sympathetic, but regardless of whether overall you find her likeable, she does remain absolutely fascinating throughout.